Good afternoon, everyone. This is Darlene with Generations Health. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, But I'm in my 50s, the myths and realities of young onset dementia, presented by Jennifer FitzPatrick. We're so grateful to have the Village at Rockville sponsoring today's program, and we have Rochelle Clarke joining us. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to invite her on to share a little bit about the Village at Rockville. But first, there's a couple things I need to cover with you. The first is everyone is going to be muted, and that is simply to eliminate any background noise. However, this is an interactive program, so we do encourage you to ask questions, to answer questions. If you have comments, please feel free to share. And you can do that by utilizing the chat feature. As a reminder, if you scroll across the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little banner that pops up. And on that, you're going to see a bubble that says chat. And when you click on that, that will launch the chat feature, and it will probably pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, when you use chat, your questions, comments, answers, those are only going to be seen by Jennifer, Rochelle, and myself, and that is simply for privacy reasons. But we do encourage you to ask questions and answer questions, so please feel free to communicate with us. Now, as I mentioned, we're so grateful to have the Village at Rockville sponsoring today's program for you, and I would like to invite Rochelle Clarke to join us. You can see her there, but I'd like her to unmute herself and share a little bit about the Village at Rockville. Rochelle?
Thank you, Darlene. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rochelle Clarke. I serve as the admissions manager here at the Health Center at the Village at Rockville. I oversee admissions for assisted living memory support, long-term care, memory care, and short-term rehabilitation. Our goal is really to create an environment that understands and supports our residents living with Alzheimer's and other dementia-related diagnoses. And we really do tailor our daily experiences so that we can learn from the residents and what their care needs are. Would like you to know that we currently do have availability in assisted living memory support as well as long-term care memory care. And if you don't mind, I would like to share with you a nice video of a little snippet of our community. And following, I will share with you my contact information should you like to contact me directly via phone or email. So you may take a look and ask questions about our services and our rates. Do enjoy the video. So what you're looking at here is our dining and living area for our memory support neighborhood. This is where our residents gather with family and friends and with our connected living staff, where they engage in various activities. We have a robust activity program right now, limiting one-on-one in the rooms and not communally. This is our beautiful memory support garden right off the neighborhood. On a beautiful sunny day, you can enjoy this, your loved one, with their staff or other visitors. In our assisted living, we feature 50 apartments. 18 of those are dedicated for our memory support, featuring studios, studio deluxes, and one bedrooms. Here is an example of a studio deluxe apartment that we offer. We can furnish them with all of the furnishings that you need. You'll find when we communicate, should you contact me, all of the pricing information is all inclusive. So thank you for your time and attention. Back to you, Darlene.
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle. And again, thank you, Village at Rockville, for sponsoring today. All right. Do you want to better understand young onset dementia and how to support a loved one dealing with it? If so, today's presentation was created for you. Our presenter today is the author of Cruising Through Caregiving, Reducing the Stress of Caring for Your Loved One, and a longtime gerontology instructor at Johns Hopkins University's Certificate on Aging program. She is one of less than 800 certified speaking professionals worldwide and has been featured in national media such as The Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, U.S. News and World Report, CBS, ABC, and many more. When she's not working, she spends her time fantasizing about when she will be able to wander the aisles of TJ Maxx and Marshalls without a mask. Please join me in welcoming from Kent Island, Maryland, Jennifer FitzPatrick, MSW.
So great to be here with you all today. Thanks again to Rochelle. And looking at the beautiful community that the Village at Rockville is, it makes me think I cannot wait until we are back on that beautiful campus, that beautiful property, doing these events, and we can all see each other. But in the meantime, we're going to make this the best that we can. As Darlene mentioned, if you have any questions or comments, please write in the chat section. We do want you to get as much as possible out of this and all your questions answered. If there is a question that we don't know the answer to, we're going to do our very, very best to direct you to a resource where you can find the answer. So let's go ahead and begin. So young onset Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, most of us tend to think about dementia as an older person's problem. But in fact, the first person who was identified to have had Alzheimer's disease by Dr. Alzheimer back in 1906 was only 51 years old. And a lot of people don't realize that. So actually the very first person to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease was a very young person, what most of us would consider middle-aged. So Dr. Alzheimer identified the plaque and tangles that you probably have heard about as associated with Alzheimer's. Up until 1906, that senility was considered normal for old people. And we don't really use the word senility anymore, but senility or dementia, memory impairment, cognitive impairment, up until 1906, they finally figured out that is not normal, and it just simply does not happen to everybody. In fact, plaques and tangles, even though they seem like scary words and we associate them with memory impairment, we can be younger and have plaques and tangles. Now, you might realize that our bodies actually sometimes have cancers in them, little cancers that just dissipate. It never becomes a problem. Pardon me. And the same thing is actually true of plaques and tangles, that your body just deals with them and it's not really enough to cause a problem. So young onset dementia in the media. While young onset dementia or early onset dementia is quite rare, when there's a public figure that has that condition, it certainly gets a lot of press. And you might remember Coach Pat Summitt. She was the Lady Vols women's basketball coach. Jim McMahon, former Chicago Bears quarterback. And more recently, we're hearing about celebrity mothers. So Kimberly Williams Paisley, you might remember her from, she's been in shows like According to Jim, Nashville. She probably most famously was in the Father of the Bride films. She had a mom that had a young onset dementia, a type of frontotemporal dementia. And she's famously married to country singer Brad Paisley. And Kimberly Williams Paisley actually wrote this really terrific book about her family and her mom's journey called Where the Light Gets In. So she's been a big advocate. She's done a lot of talking about her mom's young onset diagnosis. Another example is Lauren Miller Rogen. She's a writer, a filmmaker, and she's actually famously the spouse of actor comedian Seth Rogen. And she hasn't written a book, but she's done some pretty amazing things on behalf of young onset Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. She and her husband and her dad created the charity. It used to be called Hilarity for Charity, but it's now called HFC. So HFC, it used to be called Hilarity for Charity. And what they do is they provide grants for people to stay in their homes if they have a loved one who has dementia. So we are hearing more and more, people are being more open than ever before about young onset dementias. What is dementia? And for many of you on this program, you probably already know what dementia is, but I just like to clarify in case there's anybody that's a little new to the material. It's just a set of symptoms: confusion, memory loss. Having dementia really isn't a true diagnosis in and of itself. It's really simply a collection of symptoms. And those symptoms can include short-term memory loss, poor judgment, getting confused, personality changes, getting lost in familiar places. And so all of us have probably know somebody who has had these symptoms. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have Alzheimer's or frontotemporal or vascular, which we'll talk about in a few moments. All dementia, so if somebody does have any of these symptoms, what we want is to encourage them to get a diagnosis. We never want to jump to the conclusion that it's something really bad or long-term. It may be, but we don't want to jump to that conclusion. It can be something reversible, something treatable. For example, sometimes when somebody, especially an older person, has a urinary tract infection, that person oftentimes will exhibit delirium symptoms. And that person will then, a doctor or prescriber will give them an antibiotic and the symptoms go away. For a lot of times, older persons will maybe have memory issues and confusion and judgment problems related to depression as they age. And so, of course, if somebody has those, that's what's causing the dementia-like symptoms, we call that pseudo-dementia. We want that person to get the help they need and reverse the problem. But of course, what we're here to talk about today is the irreversible. So I just wanted to mention, if anybody's not sure what's going on with their loved one, or if you're on to just simply get information for yourself, just know that you never want to jump to the conclusion. You want your loved one to get a proper workup. Now, early onset dementia, for a very long time, that was really the common vernacular, but we're moving to the term young onset dementia or younger onset. And one of the reasons that the gerontological and geriatric community has moved toward this is because oftentimes the term early onset was being confused for early stages, because with different types of dementia, there's early, middle, and late stages. So the term young, meaning that it's happening at a younger age, is usually going to be a better description for what we're talking about today. So some of the facts. So first of all, I want to put everybody's mind at a collective ease. While young onset dementia does happen, it's not frequent. It's much more likely that if someone's going to have a dementia, an irreversible dementia like Alzheimer's, it's probably going to be when you're much older. 51 is very unusual. But the whole definition of young onset is if you begin to have symptoms before the age of 65. Typically begins in your 50s, and sometimes it could be in your 20s, 30s, 40s. Incredibly rare, though. Incredibly rare. If someone's going to have young onset dementia, typically it's going to occur in the 50s. So what are some thoughts about why does this happen? So for one, Down syndrome, people who have Down syndrome are very, very likely to have an additional double whammy of Alzheimer's disease in addition to having Down syndrome. And the National Down Syndrome Society says about 30% of people who are in their 50s that have Down syndrome do also have Alzheimer's type of dementia, and then about half of people with Down syndrome in their 60s have Alzheimer's type dementia. So that's one reason, or one where there's a link. There's a link with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's. Now, for a really long time, I've been in this field for a long time. I know Rochelle has been as well. And a lot of people in our field for a long time thought, well, if someone has the early onset or the young onset dementia, it progresses more rapidly. And what we have found is that's probably not true for most people. For most people, so Alzheimer's, for example, person lives with the condition on average 9 or 10 years. Most people, if they have young onset or they have traditional age, whereas the symptoms began 65 or after, It's not that it moves more quickly. What we find oftentimes is the person just took a long time to get diagnosed properly. And so it seems like the dementia sped quickly by. Feel free to write in with any comments or questions at all. We want to try to answer as many of those as possible and get you the information that you need. If one question that we seem to get a lot in this field is probably a lot of you have heard that if your mom or dad or sister or brother has had Alzheimer's, that you probably are at additional risk. And that's true, just like it is of so many other different health maladies out there. But that said, if your parent was, say, diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at 85 or 78, that is traditional age. And so if you're 50 and your mom's caregiver, I know a lot of you will be thinking, oh, I'm worried. Am I going to have young onset? Probably not. So if your parent, you do have an additional risk if you have a parent or sibling, a first degree relative who has, especially Alzheimer's disease, but you probably don't have to be additionally concerned about it happening at a younger age. And overall, the big risk factors for Alzheimer's disease for traditional age are getting older is the biggest one, having a first degree relative, mom, dad, brother, sister, heart disease, and diabetes, and then also having had a major head injury at some point in your life. Caregiving does not cause young onset dementia. And a lot of people really do. When they're caregiving for a loved one, they start to think, maybe this is happening to me too. But you know what caregiving often does cause? A lot of stress, a lot of, being stressed out. And so it's really, really, really important to not do caregiving alone and to be, joining resources like this, like you're here today for this program, going to Alzheimer's Association workshops and support groups, reading books that can give you support, getting breaks, getting help like folks at Village at Rockville and Rochelle. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of young onset. And we're going to just talk, because Alzheimer's is not the only type of young onset. There are several different types, but again, I want everybody to remember that this is rare. Most people who do have a dementia, it's going to be when they're much, much older. So most cases, if you ever are going to have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease or CJD, they occur between the ages of 60 and 65. This is a very unique type of dementia, and the person lives about a year to 18 months. So if your loved one has been around for more than a year, 18 months, and has had issues, this is probably not what the person has. One of the biggest special considerations that distinguishes it from Alzheimer's are the vision issues and the blindness that occurs with this person. Huntington's disease. This is one of the conditions that you actually can get a blood test and determine, do you have the gene that's going to cause this issue? So this is commonly diagnosed pretty young, between 30 and 50. Again, very rare. And this actually is one of the few conditions that we can actually take a blood test and say, yeah, this is something that you have the gene for. Frontotemporal dementia, again, right now, family history is the only risk factor that we know of, whereas with Alzheimer's disease, we know that there are many other risk factors. Again, not just because your mom, dad, brother, sister has frontotemporal dementia does not mean that you will have it. It just means that there's a risk factor. It almost always occurs as an early onset. And Kimberly Williams Paisley, who we talked about a little while ago, her mom had it before age 65. I want to say that I think her mom was about 60, perhaps 60, or maybe a little younger than that. She had a type of frontotemporal dementia. One of the stories that Kimberly Williams Paisley talks about in her book, Where the Light Gets In, and again, I really recommend it. It's very, very good. It's a memoir, but she talks about when she was getting married to her husband, Brad Paisley, that, her mom sort of made a big deal that she didn't really have a role in the wedding. And I guess one of the things that she talked about was that the mom had said that, your sister's your maid of honor and your brother's in the wedding party and your dad's walking you down the aisle and I don't have a role. And she says that this is really out of character for her mom to say something like that. And so at the last minute, they gave her a reading, and Mrs. Williams had trouble with the reading, which was concerning, but it was, a really exciting, busy day. And so nobody, I guess, thought too much about it. But they didn't really see the memory issues. For people who have frontotemporal dementia, we see behavioral and language problems typically, a lack of impulse control more frequently than we would see the memory at the forefront. So young onset Alzheimer's disease, most frequently, it can occur in the 30s and 40s, but unlikely. If you're going to have a young onset type, it's probably going to begin in the 50s. Only about 5% of all Alzheimer's diagnoses are of the young onset type. And there's about 6 million Americans who have Alzheimer's disease, almost 6 million Americans who have Alzheimer's disease. And just keep in mind, it is a very small number. But that said, it's very significant if it's happening to you or your loved one. So we're not going to play these videos, but I wanted, Darlene, if you could attach these videos to the chat section in case folks would like to watch them. If you have a loved one who has been diagnosed with a young onset, I encourage you to take a look at these videos. This is on the Alzheimer's Association's website, and this is of the DeMoe family. And they partnered with the University of Pittsburgh on research project. Very, very tragic story. This family, there was a father who had young onset Alzheimer's disease many years ago. And then he and his wife went on to have 6 children. And when one of the adult kids, I believe he was in his 40s, started having cognitive issues, some of the other family members said, do you think that could be similar to what Dad had? And as it turned out that in this DeMoe family, 5 of the 6 adult kids had young onset Alzheimer's. This is one of, so not every young onset Alzheimer works like this, but this was one where there was a very clear genetic link. So 5 out of the 6 in that family had it. Now, each child had a 50-50 chance, and it was literally just like flipping the coin for each adult child. It wasn't that half of them were definitely going to get it. They could have had a 7th child who didn't have it and an 8th child who didn't have it, but each individual child that was born had a 50-50 chance because the father had this genetic link. So it's a very, very sad story, but it's also in a lot of ways a very big story of hope, because the mom and the one sister who didn't have it just made such a big commitment to taking good care of that family, getting them involved in research. And for a lot of people who have a dementia, but especially somebody who has a young onset dementia, they often find participating in a research project to be so fulfilling and to contribute to science, because they want to protect the generations after them. They don't want their kids, their grandkids. And interestingly, if you look at the video or any subsequent video about the DeMoe family, you'll see that they're at the point where the grandkids are thinking, should they get tested? And it's a really, really tough situation for this family. But this is not always the way a young onset diagnosis works. For some families, it really is, there is that very specific genetic link. So, so the familial gene, so the determinant gene, and there's a neurologist from Columbia that that is working with this deterministic gene, and I believe there's about 300 families worldwide that have that type of young onset. Another family is the Noonan family out of Massachusetts, and I have attached a video that an article and a video about this family that you might want to check out at some point. I'm going to ask Darlene to include that also in the chat section in case you'd like to cut and paste that. And again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to write in. We would be glad to answer them. So young onset, so Parkinson's disease can be a young onset condition as well. Overall, Parkinson's disease can be a young onset. That said, not everybody that has Parkinson's disease has dementia. Some people will have dementia eventually with Parkinson's disease, and some people will not. Dementia symptoms are typically going to be secondary. So we talked about with frontotemporal dementia, a lot of times it's impulse control problems, behavioral, language, that is going to be more associated in the beginning. With Parkinson's disease, of course, we see the stiffness, the impaired speech, the tremors. There's a lot of data to suggest that the younger that the person is when they have the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So we think about somebody like Michael J. Fox. So Michael J. Fox, you probably know, had years and many, gosh, I want to say it's almost maybe 30 years that he's been public with his diagnosis. It's been quite a while. But somebody that's diagnosed with Parkinson's on the younger side, probably less likely to have the dementia, whereas if somebody's older, more likely. But this can be a type. And these are just some of the, so vascular dementia as it we're moving on to vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is really associated with strokes, mini strokes, heart attack, diabetes. Anything that's generally good for your heart is going to be good to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's, vascular dementia. And it's really basically common sense. I know most people are like, hey, tell me, should I take, extra of certain vitamin, or what can I do? But really, it's anything that's good for your heart is going to be probably good for your head, as evidenced by the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And not just for the young onset, but for any age, the onset of any age. Interesting study. So a lot of times families struggle so very much with a loved one. Dad doesn't remember your face, doesn't remember who you are, or calls you by his sister's name. Well, there was a really interesting study a few years ago that talked about that inability to recognize famous faces being a symptom of early dementia. And I thought that was interesting, not just your familiar faces that in your family, because famous faces to a lot of us are very familiar. We see them in movies or television or commercials, or they're our favorite singer, something like that. And if we're not able to recognize them, I thought that was something really interesting. So of course, persons who have young onset dementia have a special set of problems. When somebody's 85, it's always a tragedy. Whenever someone is diagnosed with dementia, it's a tragedy. We never want to see somebody decompensate and struggle with cognition. But when somebody's 85, we tend to think, well, okay, they're older, they've lived a really, really long life, their brain worked well. When somebody, and again, not to say that it's any less sad and awful and difficult for somebody going through that and for family members being their caregiver, but typically that person is retired. Typically that person's children are raised. Typically that person is set up with some kind of, either they have Social Security, hopefully they have some savings for if they need anything when they're older. But a big problem we see is a young onset person is still in the workforce. And when we talked a few moments ago about Pat Summitt, we talked about Pat Summitt being, she was a basketball coach, a really, really successful ladies basketball coach in college sports. And she had a job. I mean, she had a big job where people depended on her. And I actually have a colleague who, her mom was a very, very smart accountant. And they had such a hard time when her mom was diagnosed, or she didn't get a diagnosis, actually. The doctor didn't know what it was. They thought there was all kinds of things that they thought might be going on. Oh, you're just getting older. Oh, it's just a little forgetfulness. But she was making basic math mistakes as an accountant. And she ultimately wound up getting fired. And, not in addition to having young onset Alzheimer's, she became very depressed, and the adult kids really had a tough time figuring out and finally getting her diagnosed. And by the time she actually was diagnosed, she'd actually gone through a lot of her savings, her 401k. She wasn't able to get a new job. And unfortunately, her job, if they had really known, if they had understood that this valued, loyal employee never really made a lot of mistakes, started really making mistakes now, perhaps they would have offered her perhaps some disability. Perhaps they would have, there would have been some kind of way for she could have seen an elder law attorney and protected some of those assets to get herself some care. So being in the workforce is something that a lot of people with young onset face. Still raising kids. This is a big problem. And Kimberly Williams Paisley was raised. She and her siblings, they were adults. But Lauren Miller Rogan has talked really openly about, I think she was maybe 23, 24 when her mom still had symptoms. And not to say she was still being raised by her mom, but that she was still a young adult and just starting to launch her own life. But there are, you think about, I have a friend who is my age. She's 47 and she just had a baby 2 years ago. And you think about it, heaven forbid she gets young onset at 57 years old and her child, would be 12 years old. So we do see a lot of people having kids later, and sometimes they're still raising children. They're still in the midst of raising their families when this tragic diagnosis hits. A lot of times, like what happened with my friend whose mom was the accountant who did such a good job until she started having the symptoms. A lot of doctors, especially if they're not geriatricians or geriatric psychiatrists or neurologists who specialize in aging and memory, they're not even considering an irreversible dementia as a possibility. They look at it as an older person's condition. And again, most of the time it is, but it does sometimes happen to younger folks. So that can be a challenge. And one of the challenges I see and that I would recommend to all of you, especially if you've got a loved one or yourself that you're concerned about, is go see a geriatric psychiatrist, go see a geriatrician. They have a lot of experience with this, especially if somebody's younger. And I've said that to people and they say, oh, well, my husband would never go to a doctor where geriatric was part of the word. It's same thing with elder law attorney. Oh, my loved one would never go to an elder law attorney. He doesn't consider himself old. And maybe you don't advertise that or get into too much detail that, oh gosh, this is a special doctor for older people. But people who are geriatricians and geriatric psychiatrists just simply have a lot more experience with these conditions because they work mostly with older adults. And so they might be able to catch something that a doctor that doesn't see it as frequently would have missed. So feel free to write in any comments or any questions at all. Keeping an eye on the chat section. Doesn't seem like we have anything so far. So of course, with best practices, I always say to anybody who's worried about their memory or sees changes that cause them concern, go get a full medical workup. Start with your primary docs. If you have a good relationship with a primary practitioner, start there. But if you're not getting the answers that you need and that you deserve, you may want to move on to a specialist. And I do believe that geriatric psychiatrists and geriatricians, in my experience, they're really great diagnosticians. If there's something happening with an older person's cognition or judgment or memory. And I think they're also can be very, very good at weeding out, okay, could this be delirium? Could this be depression? Is there a B12 deficiency that they have had a lot of experience with that? So resources, we talked about my friend's mom who was an accountant, and wouldn't it have been so beautiful if she had a diagnosis and she could have gotten on disability and not used up her money. And then ultimately she would have maybe able to use that for assisted living or for home care, but she spent a lot of her assets, or she talked to an elder law attorney and was able to figure out how to plan her assets so they lasted for the rest of her life, which unfortunately she wasn't able to do. So bringing up elder law attorney, I constantly bring this up. I almost always am recommending an elder law attorney, but with an elder law attorney, especially if there's any assets, if there's a home that's owned, if there's a spouse that lives in the community and your loved one has young onset Alzheimer's, they're a breadwinner, you need to talk to an elder law attorney about how to protect the assets legally and ethically so you can keep your home. If your loved one ever needs to go to a nursing home or ever needs to apply for Medicaid, you can keep a vehicle, a car, you have a certain amount of money to live on. I think it's always a great idea if there's any assets at all. Now, I just talked to a friend of the family this week where there's a cognitive issue, and the person literally has just such a small amount of money. I don't know that it's even worth it for them to talk to an elder law attorney, but I will tell you that's a rare situation. Most of the time, people have something. Not always, but a lot of times people do have, maybe they have a 401k, maybe they have an IRA, maybe they own a home, maybe they have a lot of jewelry, maybe they have a coin collection. I think it's worth having that conversation, and a lot of elder law attorneys will give you a consult for, quick 15 minutes complimentary to see if it's appropriate for you all to work together. And these are two websites where I feel like you can find elder law attorneys that would understand. I don't believe it's a good idea just to go to your family attorney. People do this all the time, and a lot of them simply just don't know the Medicaid laws and the asset protection laws and how to do that legally. For example, if you go to an elder law attorney, I'm just going to give you one example, and I write about this in Cruising Through Caregiving. If you wanted to, maybe you are the daughter of maybe you're a 30-year-old woman, and your dad's 53, and you want to get paid to take care of your dad. You don't want to hire a home care aide. You can talk to an elder law attorney about how dad can legally pay you, and it won't count against an eventual Medicaid application. I don't want to get into too much detail about that because I'm not an attorney, but I strongly recommend at least talking to an elder law attorney if you have any assets whatsoever. And again, especially if it's young onset, and there's a spouse or a partner, or maybe there's a child with a disability that maybe you still have minor children or a child with a disability. Super important to understand what your options are. So as far as resources go, all of these are some great places. So Alzheimer's disease, ALZ.org, We're HFC, the AFTD.org, LBDA.org. So Lewy Body Dementia Association, another young onset type of dementia. We gave a few examples earlier. It's Parkinson's disease dementia and dementia with Lewy body dementia. So these are a couple of resources where you can find support groups, both in person and virtual, and in most areas, they're virtual right now. But that can be a lifesaver, especially if you join one that is for young onset, because a lot of times, and Lauren Miller Rogan, I'm actually on the board of the care advisory board of her charity, hfc.org, and their website is wearehfc.org. She talks very openly about the idea that when she joined, she wanted to join a support group because she was, having challenges dealing with what was going on with her mother. And she said she felt so out of touch with some of the other people in the group, and not because, they were just so much older and they were dealing with different issues. Like, hey, we've been married for 50 years, or my mom is 85 and I'm 65. And she's like, my mom is, 50 and I'm 20 something. So again, not to say that there's anything bad about going to a support group where there's all different age groups, but sometimes going to a young onset one can be really helpful. All of these organizations have support groups, and in particular, the Alzheimer's Association has a 24-hour helpline, which is 800-272-3900. It's open 24 hours a day. It is definitely, I'm not saying they're going to be able to fix all your problems, but they can definitely point you in the right direction. There's always a staff person on to talk to you. And know that even if your loved one doesn't have Alzheimer's, maybe they have Lewy body dementia, maybe they have vascular dementia, maybe they have frontotemporal dementia, they will still try to help you. You don't have to necessarily have an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So all of these have support groups, and there are grants sometimes available in these organizations that you can check out. And I think that they are some great resources to be enjoying and getting some help. It can really, I think sometimes support groups can be the biggest lifesaver to a family caregiver, to know that you are not the only person going through the problem. that you're not the only person that is experiencing this. And with Lauren Miller Rogan, I thought that that was such an interesting thing that she talked about, like just knowing that there were other young people that they were having the same issues about missing the relationship with a mom at such a young age. So what I'd like to do, I know a couple people were writing in asking for the slides, and we will absolutely make them available to you. If you are interested in a free chapter of Cruising Through Caregiving, all you have to do is go to cruisingthroughcaregiving.com. We are very welcome. We're very glad to send you all of the worksheets and the first chapter of the book if you go to cruisingthroughcaregiving.com, and I'm sure Darlene will write that in the chat section. But in the meantime, we're going to invite Rochelle back to talk to you again. But if you would like to ask either Rochelle or I any questions at all, or if you have any comments, or maybe you'd like to share your story, a little bit about what's going on with your family, something that you've tried, something that's a challenge to you, we are very open to hearing that. So we're going to leave that chat section open, but I'm going to invite Rochelle Clarke back to join us and share a few more words of interest about the Village at Rockville.
Jennifer, thank you so much for your thought-provoking and informative presentation. I learned a lot on the topic myself, especially those really neat tidbits regarding qualifying and eligibility for resources. So thank you. We will really hope that you enjoyed the topic as well, and would like to invite you back with us. Next time we're going to meet, Generations will be presenting and hosting, facilitating on October the 21st from 3 to 4 p.m. The program title will be on When You're Already a Worrier, How to Manage Anxiety During These Unprecedented Times. If anyone has any questions regarding the Village at Rockville and the services we provide, I'm so happy to assist. I can answer in the chat box, or you may reach out to me directly. On your screen is my direct telephone number, as well as my email address.
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle, and thank you for the Village at Rockville for sponsoring today's program. We do have some extra time, so if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to utilize your chat box and ask questions, or if you have any comments, please feel free to, again, to use the chat. If you joined us late, not really sure where to find that, if you scroll across the bottom of your screen, you'll see a bubble that says chat, and you can click on that, and that will launch your chat feature. If you are interested in a copy of the free chapter from Cruising Through Caregiving, I did put the website into the chat, so you can copy and paste that and it will take you there. We also, if you would please take just a couple minutes, it's a very quick survey, but if you can let us know what you thought of today's program, that would be great. And again, I did place that in the chat box as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I will leave this open for just another minute. If you have any questions for Rochelle or for Jennifer, I know that they would be happy to answer them for you. Thank you so much for your time today.